these are ones that they're almost sure that Paul didn't write. Part of the reason why they're almost sure that Paul didn't write them is that some of these don't even sound like things that Paul would say. Right? You can compare and contrast. If you divide them up this way, you can be like, well, these kind of look a lot like those, but these are very different in a wide variety of ways. Right? We saw huge differences between the themes of the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, and the Gospel of John. If somebody showed you the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Mark and told you they were written by the same author, would you believe them? No, because they're really different in a lot of ways. Well, similarly, these are pretty different, which is why scholars are like, even though it says, if you open it up to 1st and 2nd Timothy, it says from Paul to Timothy. Most scholars, almost all scholars today are like, Paul didn't write that. It's highly unlikely that Paul wrote that. So there are three groups of letters. We are going to look at some Pauline letters in this class. You guys are going to read 1 Corinthians, and you guys are going to read Galatians, and we're going to talk about 1 Thessalonians today. Those are all part of the group that are considered the authentic Pauline letters. We're not going to have time to look at the other two groups, so we won't have time to talk about how they're different. But you should know that they're there. Now, it talks about Paul in the Acts of the Apostles, right? The Acts of the Apostles used to be part of which book? I told you guys this before, but I only mentioned it once, so I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't remember. But I said before that Acts was originally part of one larger book that included which gospel? No? You're just going to list them all. It was originally part of Luke. We didn't read the Gospel of Luke, but Luke Acts was one big book that somebody cut in half and separated out into two parts. Luke covers, Luke is similar to Matthew and Mark because it's one of the synoptics, right? Jesus is born, he does all these miraculous things, he dies, he rises from the dead, and then the Acts begins with, right after he rose from the dead and disappeared, this is what his disciples started to do. And one of the people that there are stories about is Paul. Even though Paul did not apparently, nobody claims that Paul knew Jesus or anything like that. Paul converted to the Jesus movement after Jesus was gone. Paul doesn't claim to have ever met Jesus. It doesn't claim in Acts that he knew Jesus or anything like that. But he converted to the movement sometime after Jesus' death. So there are stories about Paul in Acts, and there are stories about, or not stories about, but we know about Paul from the letters that we presume are authentic ones. If you're a scholar and you're going to do the historical Paul, did Paul really say or do these things? Which for you is going to be a more reliable source? Paul's letters or the or the Acts of the Apostles? Why Acts? But if we're looking for information about what Paul said and did. Yeah. Right? Remember the 4 criteria that we came up with before? What's older, Paul's letters or the Acts of the Apostles? Paul's letters. Yeah. Paul's letters were written starting in the late 40s. Right? The oldest stuff in the New Testament is Paul's letters. If you want to know about Paul, the most reliable place to go to is those authentic Pauline letters. Now, Bart Ehrman points out that there are some differences between what it says about Paul in Acts and what Paul says about himself in his letters. I want you to look, get into groups of 2 or 3 or whatever, and look from 184 to 186, where he talks about the differences between Acts, what it says about Paul in Acts, and what Paul says about himself in his letters. And I want you in your groups of 2 or 3 just to kind of summarize what are some of the main things that Ehrman points out that are key differences between Acts and Paul's letters.